Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When Andrew Wilson moved into his dream home, he never imagined a battle brewing next door. For 7 years, his backyard was a haven of joy, until Mark Rivers arrived, claiming the land was his. What started as a neighborly dispute spiraled into a high-stakes war of property lines, deception, and resilience. Andrew Wilson had spent the last 7 years building the life he'd always dreamed of. His family's home, nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood just outside Chicago, was his sanctuary. The 2-story house with its pristine white siding and a wrap-around porch exuded charm and warmth. Beyond the house stretched a spacious backyard, transformed into an oasis for family and friends, a sparkling blue pool, a barbecue area, and a well-maintained lawn bordered by vibrant flower beds. The land, slightly larger than the standard plots in the neighborhood, had been a stroke of luck. 10 years ago, the previous owner had purchased a small portion of the neighboring property to expand the backyard. When Andrew and his wife Emily bought the house, they were thrilled to inherit the added space. It wasn't just a backyard, it was a retreat. Weekends often saw lively barbecues, pool parties, or quiet evenings around the fire pit. For their children, aged 11 and 8, and their golden retriever, Charlie, it was paradise. The neighborhood itself was the epitome of suburban bliss, tree-lined streets, friendly neighbors, and a sense of camaraderie. Over the years, Andrew had formed close bonds with several families. His kids had playmates next door, Emily had her book club, and Charlie was the unofficial mascot of the block. It was a community where everyone knew each other's names and looked out for one another. But everything changed the day the house next door was no longer empty. For months, it had stood vacant after the elderly couple who owned it had passed away. Andrew had heard rumors that their son, Mark Rivers, had inherited the property. Mark, a 46-year-old lawyer with a reputation for being ambitious and headstrong, was largely a mystery to the neighborhood. When Andrew saw the moving truck pull up one Saturday morning, he decided to be neighborly and introduce himself. To Andrew's surprise, Mark came to him first. Without so much as a smile, Mark strode across the lawn and stood at the edge of Andrew's backyard. The friendly greeting Andrew had prepared died on his lips as Mark's eyes scanned the pool and the barbecue area with a cold, assessing gaze. "You need to clear this area," Mark said bluntly, pointing to the pool. "That land belongs to me." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Andrew blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. "Excuse me," he said, trying to process the accusation. "That part of your backyard," Mark continued, his voice firm, "is on my property. It's my land, and I expect you to remove your pool and whatever else you've built there immediately." Andrew's initial shock gave way to disbelief. He explained calmly that the land had been legally purchased by the previous owner over a decade ago and was now part of his property. He even offered to show Mark the documentation, but Mark wasn't interested. "That land belonged to my parents," Mark said sharply. "I don't know what deal you or anyone else made, but it was wrong. I'll be taking it back." Andrew felt his temper rising but maintained his composure. "Mark, I have all the necessary documents to prove that this land legally belongs to me. If there's any confusion, we can resolve this civilly." Mark scoffed. "I'll be bringing the police if you don't cooperate. And trust me, I'll take this to court if I have to." Andrew watched in stunned silence as Mark turned on his heel and walked back toward his house. It was a jarring introduction to his new neighbor and a harbinger of the storm to come. Later that evening, as Andrew sat in his backyard with Emily, recounting the bizarre encounter, the peaceful glow of the string lights overhead felt almost ironic. What had always been a place of tranquility now felt overshadowed by an uneasy tension. "I'll call the lawyer tomorrow," Andrew said firmly. Emily nodded, her expression a mix of concern and determination. For the first time since moving into their dream home, Andrew felt the security and happiness he'd worked so hard to build begin to shift. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of a battle that would test not just his patience, but his resolve to protect what was rightfully his. Andrew Wilson woke up the morning after his tense encounter with Mark Rivers feeling unsettled. He had dealt with difficult situations before, but nothing quite like this. A neighbor asserting ownership over a portion of his backyard. As he sipped his coffee, he gazed out at the pool, now tinged with the shadow of doubt cast by Mark's accusations. By mid-morning, Andrew decided to take the initiative. He contacted his real estate attorney, Michelle Graves, and explained the situation in detail. Michelle reassured him that if the land was legally purchased, there was no cause for concern. "Get me the paperwork from the sale," she said confidently. "We'll make sure everything is in order." Andrew spent the afternoon rifling through his filing cabinet, eventually finding the property deed, the purchase agreement, and the boundary surveys conducted when he bought the house. The documents clearly showed the expanded boundaries, including the pool and barbecue area. He scanned and emailed them to Michelle, who replied later that evening, "Everything checks out. If your neighbor pushes this further, we'll be ready." Andrew hoped that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. The following day, Mark showed up unannounced, carrying a clipboard and a tape measure. "I need access to your backyard to confirm the property lines," he demanded. Andrew's patience was already wearing thin. "You're not stepping onto my property without permission," he replied firmly. "If you have concerns, take them to your lawyer. I've already confirmed with mine that the land is legally mine." Mark's face darkened. "I warned you this wasn't over. You're not just trespassing, you're profiting off stolen land. I'll see you in court." True to his word, Mark didn't back down. Over the next few days, Andrew noticed him speaking to neighbors, pointing toward Andrew's backyard and gesturing animatedly. Soon the whispers started. At a neighborhood barbecue, Andrew overheard snippets of conversations, speculation about the property dispute, and suggestions that Andrew had taken advantage of Mark's parents. To make matters worse, Mark began sending letters to local authorities, accusing Andrew of zoning violations and illegal construction. One morning, Andrew woke up to find a city inspector at his door. "We received a complaint about unpermitted structures," the inspector explained. Frustrated but cooperative, Andrew provided all the necessary permits and documents to prove the legality of his pool and barbecue area. The inspector, visibly irritated by the baseless complaint, left after giving Andrew a clean report. Meanwhile, Mark escalated his tactics further. Flyers appeared in mailboxes around the neighborhood, suggesting that Andrew had exploited an elderly couple to expand his property. "Is this the kind of neighbor we want in our community?" the flyer read. It was signed anonymously, but Andrew had no doubt who was behind it. The growing tension began to affect Andrew's family. Emily tried to shield their children from overhearing the gossip, but their 11-year-old son, Jack, asked one evening, "Why does Mr. Rivers hate us?" The question cut Andrew deeply. Determined to push back, Andrew doubled down on his preparations. He worked closely with Michelle to gather every piece of evidence, from aerial photos of the property to detailed maps and receipts from the purchase. He even contacted the previous owner, who provided a notarized letter affirming the sale of the land. Despite the strain, Andrew found allies in the neighborhood. His closest friends, Tom and Rachel, reassured him that they didn't believe Mark's lies. "We've seen how much care you've put into your home," Rachel said. "He's just trying to bully you." But Mark's campaign of intimidation didn't stop. One night, Andrew spotted Mark pacing along the property line with a flashlight, muttering to himself. The sight was unnerving, and Andrew felt a deep unease settle over him. Mark's threats became more explicit. During another confrontation, he pointed a finger at Andrew and said, "You're going to lose everything, your backyard, your reputation, and maybe more." Andrew refused to be intimidated. "We'll let the court decide," he said. But deep down, he knew the battle was taking a toll. His once peaceful life was now consumed by a fight he never asked for. The stage was set for a confrontation that neither man would back down from, and Andrew prepared himself for the next move in Mark's relentless campaign. Andrew awoke to a bright Saturday morning, hoping for a peaceful day with his family. But as he stepped outside with a mug of coffee in hand, he froze in disbelief. A tall metallic fence now stretched across his backyard, cutting directly through his pool area and barbecue setup. The gleaming barrier was jarring, splitting his property in two like a blatant declaration of war. "Emily!" Andrew called, his voice tight with urgency. His wife hurried outside, her eyes widening as she took in the sight. Without hesitation, she grabbed her phone and began recording. The fence wasn't just an inconvenience. It was an insult, a physical intrusion on their home. The once serene backyard now felt like a battleground. Andrew examined the fence closely, noting how it had been installed hastily, with fresh dirt piled around the posts and scratches on the patio stones where it cut through the edge of the pool deck. Fuming, Andrew marched to Mark's house. This time he came prepared, his phone set to record the conversation. Mark answered the door with an air of smug satisfaction, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "What the hell is this, Mark?" Andrew demanded, gesturing toward the backyard. "I warned you," Mark said flatly. "That land is mine. Since you refused to cooperate, I took matters into my own hands." "You had no right to do this," Andrew snapped. "This is illegal. I'll have that fence torn down by the end of the day." Mark chuckled, pulling out a folder of papers. "I thought you might say that. Here's documentation proving the land belongs to me. You'll find the fence is well within my rights." Andrew scanned the papers and immediately recognized inconsistencies. The diagrams didn't match the original survey of the property lines. The signatures and stamps appeared suspiciously imprecise. "These are forgeries," Andrew said, his voice low with controlled anger. "Do you really think this will hold up in court?" Mark's smirk widened. "I guess we'll find out, but I wouldn't recommend touching that fence. Any damage will be considered destruction of my property. I'd hate to have to press charges." The conversation ended with Mark slamming the door, leaving Andrew seething. Returning to his house, he replayed the recorded interaction, carefully noting Mark's threats and admissions. Andrew immediately called Michelle, explaining the situation in detail. She was appalled by Mark's audacity. "This is a blatant violation of your property rights," she said. "I'll file an emergency injunction first thing Monday morning. In the meantime, document everything. Photos, videos, anything that proves this is on your property." That afternoon, Andrew and Emily measured the boundaries, taking meticulous notes and marking the positions of the fence posts. Their children, sensing the tension, watched quietly from the porch as their once lively backyard was reduced to a source of unease. As the sun set, Andrew felt a surge of resolve. Mark's actions were brazen, but Andrew wasn't about to be bullied into submission. He was ready to fight, no matter how long it took, to reclaim what was rightfully his. Andrew stood in his garage, staring at the row of tools neatly hung on the wall. His eyes settled on the sledgehammer, its sturdy wooden handle and weighty metal head, a silent testament to resolve. He'd spent the last 2 days documenting every detail of the fence, consulting with his lawyer, and filing the injunction. Now, with legal clarity on his side, he decided it was time to act. He stepped out into the backyard, sledgehammer in hand, his jaw set in determination. Emily, standing on the patio with her phone, gave him a reassuring nod. A few trusted neighbors, Tom and Rachel among them, had come to support Andrew. Tom stood ready with his own phone to record, while Rachel stayed inside with the kids to keep them calm. Andrew took a deep breath and swung the sledgehammer. The metallic clang of the first blow echoed across the yard, sharp and defiant. He struck again, and the fence wavered. The sound drew Mark out of his house. He stormed into his own backyard, his face twisted with fury. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he bellowed, marching toward the fence. Andrew set the sledgehammer down and turned to face him. "I'm removing this illegal fence from my property. You've already been served an injunction. Check your mailbox." Mark froze for a moment, then his expression darkened. "You're making a big mistake, Andrew. This isn't over." "It is over," Andrew replied coldly. "I've tried reasoning with you. I've followed the law. Now I'm done letting you intimidate my family." Mark's anger boiled over. He charged toward the fence, grabbing the nearest section and attempting to stop Andrew from removing it. "You have no right," he shouted, his voice cracking with rage. Andrew held his ground, but Tom stepped forward, his phone still recording. "Back off, Mark," he warned. "You're being recorded. Don't make this worse for yourself." Instead of backing down, Mark lunged toward Andrew, grabbing his shirt and pulling him back. The two men struggled briefly, and the commotion attracted the attention of more neighbors. Emily, still on the patio, quickly dialed 911. "We need police at our address immediately. My husband is being attacked by our neighbor," she said, her voice calm but urgent. Mark's aggression faltered as he noticed the growing audience and the phones capturing every moment. He released Andrew and stepped back, breathing heavily. "You'll regret this," he spat. "I'll ruin you." Andrew, standing firm, said nothing. He turned back to the fence, picked up the sledgehammer, and resumed dismantling it. Mark retreated to his house, but slammed the door open with such force that it echoed across the neighborhood. Minutes later, the police arrived. Mark came back outside, protesting loudly that he was the victim and accusing Andrew of property destruction. But Andrew calmly handed the officers the court-issued injunction and pointed to the documentation proving his ownership. Witnesses stepped forward, including Tom, to corroborate Andrew's version of events. The officers reviewed the evidence, then turned to Mark. "You've been served an injunction, which means you had no right to install this fence or interfere," one officer said firmly. "If you touch Mr. Wilson or his property again, you'll be arrested." Mark, his face flushed with embarrassment and rage, muttered something under his breath and retreated inside. As the police left, Andrew dismantled the final section of the fence, feeling the weight of the conflict lifting slightly. The neighbors who had gathered began to clap, showing their support. For the first time in weeks, Andrew allowed himself a small smile. This was only the first battle, but it felt like a victory nonetheless. The courthouse was bustling with activity as Andrew arrived with his lawyer, Michelle Graves. Despite the nerves tightening in his chest, Andrew felt prepared. His weeks of meticulous documentation and Michelle's sharp legal strategy gave him confidence. This was the day he would finally put Mark's baseless claims and aggression to rest. Mark arrived shortly after, his demeanor cold and self-assured, clutching a folder of what Andrew suspected were the same forged documents he had seen before. His lawyer, a stern-looking man in a sharp suit, whispered something to Mark before they entered the courtroom. The hearing began promptly. Mark's lawyer launched into his argument, portraying Mark as the rightful owner of the disputed land, and Andrew as someone who had taken advantage of Mark's late parents to seize property that wasn't his. The claims were dramatic, but as Michelle rose to respond, Andrew could see the cracks forming in their case. Michelle presented an array of evidence. The original purchase agreements, property surveys, and testimony from the previous owner, all clearly establishing Andrew's ownership of the land. The documents submitted by Mr. Rivers are not only inconsistent with county records, but bear hallmarks of forgery, Michelle stated firmly. She pointed out discrepancies in the signatures and the unauthorized alterations in the diagrams Mark had submitted. To solidify their case, Michelle played the recording of Andrew's confrontation with Mark, in which Mark had openly threatened Andrew and admitted to erecting the fence without permission. The courtroom fell silent as Mark's threats echoed through the speakers, his aggressive tone unmistakable. Next came the testimony. The city inspector who had visited Andrew's property took the stand, confirming that all structures on Andrew's land were properly permitted and compliant with local codes. Tom and Rachel also testified, recounting Mark's erratic behavior and the physical altercation they had witnessed. Mark's lawyer attempted to poke holes in Andrew's evidence, but their arguments were flimsy and failed to counter the overwhelming documentation Michelle had presented. When it was Mark's turn to testify, he doubled down on his claims, insisting that his parents would never have sold the land. However, his story unraveled under cross-examination as Michelle skillfully exposed his lack of concrete evidence. The turning point came when a handwriting expert, called by Michelle, testified that the signatures on Mark's documents were forged. This revelation left Mark visibly shaken, and the smug confidence he had displayed earlier evaporated. The judge, a stern woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, delivered her verdict after a brief deliberation. The evidence clearly shows that the disputed land legally belongs to Mr. Wilson. Furthermore, the actions taken by Mr. Rivers, including the erection of the fence and the submission of forged documents, constitute serious violations of the law. Mr. Rivers is ordered to pay damages for property encroachment, emotional distress, and legal fees. Additionally, this court will refer the matter of document forgery to the district attorney's office for further investigation. Andrew exhaled deeply, the weight of weeks of tension lifting off his shoulders. He turned to Michelle, who gave him a reassuring nod. It was over. Mark, on the other hand, stood in stunned silence, his lawyer hastily whispering in his ear. As the judge left the bench, Mark shot Andrew a glare, but it lacked the venom it once carried. He knew he had lost. Outside the courtroom, Andrew was greeted by Tom, Rachel, and several other neighbors who had come to support him. "You did it," Rachel said, giving him a hug. "You stood up to him, and you won." Andrew smiled for the first time in what felt like months. Justice had been served, and the nightmare that Mark had brought into his life was finally coming to an end. The verdict spread quickly through the neighborhood, and the atmosphere shifted almost overnight. The once rampant whispers of doubt and gossip about Andrew were replaced by apologies and words of support. Neighbors who had initially avoided him now stopped by to offer congratulations and express their relief that the matter was finally resolved. For Mark Rivers, the fallout was swift and severe. The court's decision not only required him to pay damages, but also triggered a formal investigation into the forged documents he had submitted. Facing the possibility of criminal charges, Mark put his house up for sale and quietly moved out of the neighborhood within a month. His departure left a palpable sense of relief among the residents. Andrew, meanwhile, focused on rebuilding the sense of community that had been strained during the conflict. He hosted a barbecue in his backyard, one of the first gatherings there since the ordeal began. The pool sparkled in the sun, the smell of grilling burgers filled the air, and laughter returned to a space that had been overshadowed by tension. The event brought neighbors closer together. Tom and Rachel toasted to Andrew's perseverance, while others shared stories about how the conflict had reminded them of the importance of standing up for one another. "You fought for what was right," one neighbor said, raising a glass, "and in doing so, you reminded us of what this neighborhood is really about." With Mark gone, the neighborhood took on a new energy. There was a sense of unity and vigilance against similar conflicts. Residents began discussing ways to improve communication and prevent disputes from escalating in the future. For Andrew and his family, life slowly returned to normal. The backyard once again became a haven of joy, where his children played, Charlie lounged in the sun, and friends gathered without the shadow of a looming fence or baseless accusations. Though the conflict had been challenging, it left an unexpected legacy. A stronger, more connected neighborhood where trust and camaraderie flourished anew. As Andrew sat on his back porch one quiet evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he reflected on the months of turmoil. The battle with Mark had tested his patience, strained his relationships, and disrupted the peaceful life he had worked so hard to build. But now, as the soft glow of the string lights illuminated his reclaimed backyard, he felt a deep sense of accomplishment. The conflict had taught him valuable lessons about perseverance and the importance of knowing and defending one's rights. Never underestimate the power of preparation, Andrew thought, recalling how the careful documentation and steady guidance of his lawyer, Michelle, had ultimately secured his victory. Beyond the legal battle, the experience had reshaped his perspective on community. The support of neighbors like Tom and Rachel had been instrumental, proving that unity could triumph over division. It wasn't just about winning a personal fight, it was about reinforcing the values of fairness and mutual respect that formed the foundation of their neighborhood. Mark's departure, though dramatic, had brought a certain closure. The legal consequences he faced served as a stark reminder to everyone that actions born of malice and deceit carried heavy repercussions. Andrew hoped it would dissuade anyone else from attempting similar behavior in the future. In the following weeks, the neighborhood thrived. Barbecues, block parties, and casual conversations over fences became more common. Andrew felt proud that his determination had contributed to a renewed sense of togetherness among the residents. As Charlie trotted over with a frisbee in his mouth, Andrew chuckled and stood to join his kids in the yard. Emily stepped out with a tray of lemonade, her smile radiant in the warm glow of twilight. For the first time in months, everything felt whole again. Andrew's thoughts turned to the future. He hoped his story would serve as an example, not just of standing up for one's property, but of the importance of resilience, unity, and the courage to face adversity head-on. His backyard, once a battleground, was now a testament to those ideals, a place of joy and harmony once more. As he threw the frisbee and watched his kids and Charlie race across the lawn, Andrew felt a profound sense of gratitude. This was home, his sanctuary, his family's retreat, and now a symbol of triumph over adversity.